Good morning and welcome to this event organised by the Royal Statistical Society here in the basement at the Resolution Foundation. I'm joined here by a very stellar panel, and we're going to talk about household cost indices. You're going to get 3 introductions at the beginning, so I'm going to keep this one super brief and just explain what the plan is for today. So the plan is we're going to hear from Sarah Cumbers at the Royal Statistical Society, and then Tony Cox, who's the chair of the Inflation Statistics User Group. Then we're going to hear from Abby Casey, who's done some work on household cost indices, and then we're going to have a presentation from Morgan about 2 nations with 2 inflations. Then we've got Chris Giles and Paul Lewis from the FT and as a financial journalist and broadcaster respectively, going to discuss what we've heard, and then we're going to have Q&A at the end, and you can put questions to us using our Slido, so please do that, and it will be lovely to hear from you. So let's have Sarah up first, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning at the Resolution Foundation. Welcome to everybody who's with us in the room, but also to all of our audience who are joining online. And thank you very much to the Resolution Foundation for hosting us today, and Greg, to you for stepping into chair at such short notice, very much appreciated. I've been at the RSS for just a few short months, but our campaign on the need for household cost indices has been a long-running campaign by the Society, having been initially proposed back in 2015 by 2 of our speakers here today, Jill Leyland and also John Aston. We saw a clear gap in the inflation data, and while there is a wide array of consumer price indices in the UK, their individual purposes had become blurred over time. And so despite having a number of indices, we didn't know enough about different households' experiences of inflation, especially the experiences of those on lower incomes. And we weren't capturing interest payments and loans, the most critical of which are mortgages. And the need for this data, of course, has become ever more stark over the last 2 years with the cost of living crisis. And so with the new Household Cost Index figures published last week, they've shed important light on people's experiences of inflation. And we're really grateful to both Jill and John for their tireless work on behalf of the Society for making the case for the HCIs. So I also want to express my thanks to the Prices team at the ONS for their hard work and the innovative way that they have worked out solutions to the challenges of developing these new indices. This kind of data is absolutely essential for policy making, and we hope that these new figures will prove useful to this government and also future governments as we head into a general election. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Now we've got Tony. Do you want the clicker thing?
Thank you, Sarah. As you heard, my name's Tony Cox, and I chair the Inflation Statistics User Group that was formerly known as the RPI-CPI User Group. And this morning, I just wanted to spend a few moments to set the scene about how we arrived at this point before you hear from the real experts about the detail and hard work that has brought us here. So, for many years, the Retail Price Index was the inflation index for the UK. It was used as the basis on which governments relied for uprating benefits and was often used in private contracts when taking account of inflation. A modified form of the RPI was used for inflation targeting until 2003, when it was superseded for this purpose by the UK's CPI. And you're going to hear more about how the CPI came about and why it is not a household measure of inflation from John Aston shortly. It was a decision by the government in 2010 to stop using the RPI for uprating benefits and replace it with the CPI that proved particularly controversial. The more so as the government continued to use the RPI for uprating many of the charges or prices it was responsible for setting, such as rail fares and student loans, so-called inflation rate shopping. The exception is it is also used to determine the amount payable to index-linked gilt holders. Then in 2013, the RPI lost its national statistics status Up to this point, the UK arguably had two classes of inflation measure, macroeconomic measures that took a look at the economy as a whole, represented by the CPI and CPIH, which includes a measure of owner-occupied housing, and a household measure represented by the RPI. Describing the RPI in this way is not without its critics, but certainly after this date it could not be argued that the UK had an officially accepted measure of inflation as experienced by households. It was at this point that Jill Leyland and John Astin, who are both here today and who will shortly be speaking, came together and first published their paper towards a household inflation measure. This was in 2015. This set the ball rolling, and in 2017, John Pullinger, the then national statistician, presented a talk titled Shaping the Future of Consumer Price Statistics. He did that here in this room at the Resolution Foundation. And I've taken a couple of slides from his presentation to illustrate what he said. John Pullinger presented the case for three classes of inflation measure to meet user needs. One based on economic principles, one based on household experience, and one a legacy measure, the RPI, which is still required to be published for legal reasons. So in doing that, he then described the future landscape. Remember, this was back in 2017. And he described a future landscape as consisting of the CPIH and CPI, which both conform to economic principles, the household index, which would put figures to the household experience of inflation, and the RPI, which was and is described by the ONS as a legacy measure. So I'm delighted to say that after many years' hard work by John Astin and Jill Leyland, and especially the ONS's prices team, that has had to work both hard and innovatively to bring that future landscape described by John Pullinger back in 2017 to life, and Abby Casey will be talking about the work of the ONS in this regard shortly, it is fitting that we are now back here at the Resolution Foundation to discuss the launch of the Household Costs Index. And as you can see, on the 4th of December, the ONS officially launched the regular publication of the HCI, and here today we're back at the Resolution Foundation to discuss the importance of this development. However, I've also included a reference to the future, and there's much work still to be done, and the true test of the work that has been done so far, and will continue, is the use of this inflation measure. And Morgan Wild from the Citizens' Advice will illustrate the use to which the HCIs can be put later in this session. Just before I hand over to one of the experts, John Astin, I should mention that the UK is not alone in this endeavour. New Zealand has been working along similar lines for some time, and I understand the USA is also in the process of developing a household inflation measure. So with that, I'll hand over to John Astin.
Thank you, Tony. I'm glad you emphasised my surname. I am not Professor Sir John Astin, who is going to be the new head of RSS. Oh, he's here.
Into the camera over there, so come round and...
Yes, sorry. Okay. So let me start by introducing myself, as I have the advantage of being largely been the father, if you like, of a major inflation measure, the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, or the HICP, known in the UK as the CPI, of course. I will tell you how this was developed in the EU in the 1990s, and I will tell you why I believe that the HICP, or CPI, is the wrong type of inflation index for measuring household inflation. Excuse me for my voice. It won't get better. It might get worse. Back in 1991, I moved from head of statistics at the DTI to the EU Statistics Office in Luxembourg, appointed as head of price statistics. Within months, I realised the most important task by far was going to be the creation of a common method of calculating consumer price indices in all the member states of the EU as a preparation for the introduction of the euro planned for the start of 1999. Most, but not all countries were keen to do this, though understandably nervous. We agreed that it would have to be compulsory, in other words, subject to an EU Council regulation. Now, I'm not going to go into the many stories over the next few years, but we got there in the end. The regulation was passed, and the first HICP indices were published on the 5th of March, 1997, and there to prove it is the news release. I'm sure you don't need proof. It rapidly became very successful and was later described by several organisations as a state-of-the-art inflation measure. But I'd like to point out one crucial aspect of the HICP. It was designed specifically to allow international comparability of inflation measures so as to allow the ECB to operate one of the criteria for judging if a country was eligible to join the monetary union. One of these key tests was the rate of inflation as measured by the HICP. If it fell below a certain criterion, entry would not be allowed, and it was explicitly stated that the HICP was not designed as a measure of household inflation, but as a macroeconomic measure of inflation, fit for macroeconomic purposes. Nowadays, I think few, if any, member states of the EU use the HICP as their national measure for such things as operating pensions or wages or prices. They stick to their older measures. Of course, we had the RPI, which was originally designed for the operating purpose. But as Tony mentioned, in 2003, the government rightly decided to replace the RPI as the Bank of England's main measure of inflation with the HICP, which was then renamed the CPI in the UK. In 2010, the government began to use the CPI for other major purposes, notably uprating public sector pensions. This, of course, is not what it was designed for. But the RPI lost its national statistic status in 2013 when it was discovered to have some basic flaws, though it is still used for calculating the interest on inflation-linked bonds. Don't know why that is, but it costs. But the ONS website clearly advises against other uses, though this is ignored by a number of companies and trade unions for uprating their prices or wages. You probably heard on the radio this morning about mobile phone companies doing this, CPI plus 3.9%, etc., which a lot of consumers don't know about. Back to my own activities briefly. Later, after I'd left the EC, I served on the RSS's what is now the Inflation User Group from 2011, and from 2015 on the ONS's Technical Advisory Panel on Consumer Prices. And during this period, I also served on an advisory group for the review of the UK's official consumer price indices, which was led by Paul Johnson. It was during this time that I realised that what we badly needed in the UK was a CPI based explicitly on the experiences and needs of households. I produced a paper, a Household Inflation Index, and shortly afterwards I discovered that I was not alone in this journey. A distinguished economist, Jill Leyland, had also written a paper along similar lines. We got together and have been close colleagues ever since, developing what has become known as the Household Costs Index. As a former vice president of the RSS, she had many useful contacts, and I'm very happy that our collaboration with the RSS over the years, not to mention today's meeting, has helped us greatly in our work, so thank you, RSS. Our original papers were effectively merged and developed and published in 2015 under the title Towards a Household Inflation Index, and a number of further developments in agreement with the ONS have taken place since then. So that's the story of how the HCI has evolved. I must say that I do feel very proud of the work I did for the EC on the HICP, CPI in the UK, which has been widely recognised as an excellent measure for macroeconomic purposes. I used it later as a model for the development of a harmonised inflation index for the COMESA group of East African countries, which is still in use. It's known as the HCPI, just to confuse things. I will say no more on this point, except simply to say that we are not suggesting that the CPI be abandoned. Indeed, it remains the best available measure for macroeconomic estimation of inflation. But the RPI is no longer recommended by the ONS for any use. It says it does not meet the required standard for designation as a national statistic. Personally, I would hope to see the HCI becoming the successor to the RPI in the reasonably near future. And just finally, and more as a postscript than anything, I'd just like to mention a couple of examples. I'm sure we'll be discussing these later. Some examples of some of the major differences between the CPI and the HCI. Firstly, the coverage of types of expenditure. The CPI does not cover any type of interest, not mortgage interest, not student loan interest, no interest at all, in fact. Why? Well, because interest is classified neither as a good nor a service. but these are major items of household expenditure. Second, the weights of several important products are badly outside the correct range. I'll mention just one: non-life insurance, cars, travel, medical, and so forth. Only about half of the consumer expenditure on this is covered in the CPI. All of it is covered in the HCI. It's worth noting, finally, that in the preface to the 2004 International Consumer Price Index Manual, it is clearly stated, I quote, "A CPI measures the rate of price inflation as experienced and perceived by households in their role as consumers." This looks to me like a good definition of the HCI. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Abby's next. You've got a mic here, so you won't need that one, yeah. But
okay?
please come up and...
I will do it. I'll need the clicker. I won't need that. Thank you very much, though. I will need the clicker.
Other way, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Abby Casey, and I've been working at the ONS on the improvements and developments of the Household Cost Indices, which has now culminated in us publishing our first quarterly estimates last Monday on the 4th of December. So just to highlight again what Tony has already raised, is the ONS has 3 use cases for our inflation measures: our economic principles, the household experience, and ongoing RPI, our legacy measure. And that then links into our current suite and landscape of inflation measures. So you have the Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupied housing costs, which is our most comprehensive measure of inflation. The Consumer Prices Index, which doesn't include the owner-occupied housing costs, but is comparable across the EU. We then have the Household Cost Indices, our household experience measure of inflation, and our legacy RPI. But focusing on our HCIs today, and just to expand on what Tony has already said about the history of the HCIs. So as mentioned, John and Jill have produced reports and shown the incredible need for the HCIs between 2014 and 2016. And we also had recommendations as part of the Paul Johnson review that recommended the use of household experience measures of inflation. And as well as that, during this period, we did go out, the ONS did go out to user consultation to get that wider view of the need for this. And it culminated in John Pullinger, our national statistician at the time, highlighting this to the UKSA, saying there is user need for a household experience measure of inflation. So, thankfully, in 2017, we published our first ever estimate of the household cost indices, but it wasn't obviously the perfect measure, and we have continued to develop as we've gone through, making improvements throughout the last, since 2017, over the last few years, with the most recent improvement our quarterly estimates of the HCIs. So how do they differ from the CPI and CPIH, our headline measures of inflation? So there are 3 key differences I wanted to highlight alongside what John has already raised in terms of the weights, our measurement, and owner-occupier housing costs. So in regards to the weights, so the HCIs use a democratic weighting approach, meaning that every household is equally weighted our spending shares are equally weighted for every household group. And this differs to the CPI and CPIH, which uses a plutocratic weighting, which looks at UK total expenditure. Meaning, when you want to have a household experience measure of inflation, the plutocratic approach weights more heavily towards higher income households because they naturally spend more of the money, and so a greater weight of that total UK expenditure. Our second difference is on the measurement. So the HCIs use a payments approach. So take the approach when a good or service is paid for, that's when we take into account that good or service, rather than a largely acquisition approach, which the CPI and CPIH use. So for example, I think student loans is a very good example here, that for HCIs, we can include student loan repayments because that's when the service of your education is paid for, compared to the CPI and CPIH, which take the acquisition, so when you actually get your education as the point of where it's included. And then finally, on owner-occupier housing costs, so the CPI does not include any housing costs in that, and the CPIH uses a rental equivalence. That differs to the HCIs, which use a direct approach to using housing. So it includes mortgage interest payments, stamp duty, and other things, for example, that you buy when you buy a house. So we've gone through how the main differences between the HCIs and CPIH and CPI, but then how do they look in comparison when we put them both on the same graph? So when we compare the aggregate HCI measure, so all households together, compared to the CPI, you can see from the chart that they roughly follow the same trend, and they are roughly in line, but you do see differences, and they do start to change when you see large changes in inflation. So for example, during the financial crash in 2008-9, and then in most recent increases in inflation. So if we just focus on the differences that we see most recently in the current rise in inflation, that's due to two main factors. So the first is the difference you see is because of our use of democratic weighting instead of plutocratic weighting. So for example, energy prices, lower income households spend a higher proportion of their income on energy prices, and with the increase in energy that we've recently seen, that is more weighted in the HCIs than it would be seen in the CPI. And then again, even more recently, that the CPI doesn't include any direct housing costs, such as mortgage rates. So with the increase in mortgages coming through, that's part of the reason the HCIs are seeing a larger increase with the inclusion of mortgage rates and the rises we're seeing recently on them as well. But I think, from my perspective, looking at the aggregates is very useful, but the main benefit of HCIs is on how it splits by different household groups. So we have tenure types, retirement status, whether a household has children or not, and its income decile, which I think is the key benefit of the HCIs, is that we can see those different groups. So if we focus first on income, so for this chart, I've included all 10 deciles. If we split all households by their income equally across 10 deciles, with the lowest deciles being the poorest households and the highest deciles being the highest income households. You can see generally that they all follow roughly the same trend, but very similarly again, you do see a divergence at periods of high and low inflation rate changes. I think if you can look carefully on the chart, you'll notice during these periods that those on low incomes, so deciles 1, 2 and 3 for example, generally have higher inflation rates at these periods of change than high income households. And that's seen across in the most recent period and in the 2009-10 dips that we saw there as well. So I'll focus now on moving to just looking at the most recent period and our high inflation that we've been recently seeing, and comparing both low and high income deciles together. So for this, I've used, for the dark blue, looks at decile 2, which is our low income households, and the green line is our decile 9, which is high income households. I've not used decile 1 and 10 for this, because the sampling does include some unusual households which do change the representation of the spending in those households. So we recommend using 2 and 9. But for this, you can see in September 2023, our most recent period that we've published, that all of the, for both high and low inflation incomes, the inflation rate has relatively converged to roughly 8.2% at that point. However, if we look back at October 2022, it was a very, very different story, where we see low-income households, which is the dark blue line, having a much higher rate of inflation than high-income households. There we go. Which, when we compare the difference, is 2.0 percentage point difference. And that's the largest difference between these groups since October 2009. So the main part of this difference is between what these groups spend the proportion of their spending on compared to each other. So mainly, the main difference here is the use of food and energy prices. And while the rises of those energy prices and food have been seen, they have a higher impact on low-income households because they spend a higher proportion of their income on those items. And you can see that when we split down into the different the contributions to the difference. I appreciate there's a lot going on in the chart, so I'll go through, try and go through as best as I can. So anything above the line that's positive is where low-income households are seeing a higher rate of inflation when you compare low and high-income households. And underneath the line where it's a negative, that is where the contribution to the difference for high-income households is higher than low-income households. So focusing on October 2022, which is the peak roughly in the middle that you can see that the blue bar and the green bar is much higher for low-income households than it is for high-income households, and that is food and housing services. And that reflects the increase in food prices and energy prices that we saw largely last year. And as I said, part of this is because low-income households spend a much larger proportion on these items than high-income households do. What is interesting, if you look most recently at the green bar, you start to see the change from it being a large driver of high inflation for low-income households to being a driver of high inflation for high-income households. And I will unpack that on the next slide. So if we look at that housing services in more detail and split it out further, we can see then the differences in energy, which is the light green line. And as you see, you can see the rises over the last year and then starting to fall off as the impact lessens on inflation. But what you do see is this big dark green line coming through at the bottom, which is owner-occupied housing costs, which is largely the mortgage interest rates coming through, and which has a larger impact on high-income households who have larger mortgages and a larger impact as a result. Which is a nice segue into looking at different tenure types, actually. So if we then focus going from income to different tenure types, you can see from the chart that the light blue line at the top in September 2023 is those that have a mortgage on their home, and they currently have the largest inflation rate of all of the tenure types at the moment, and that is with the increasing in mortgage rates that we are seeing. But it does start to flip if we go back to October 2022. So you see instead that those that own their own home and those that are private renters, so for example social renters, they have the highest inflation, and that's because they have a greater proportion of their spend on energy and food. And so when they were high earlier in the year, they see that the increase instead of the mortgage rates. And then finally, we have both the retired and those households with and without children. I've put them both on the same chart here because they generally show the same trends, and there is a good correlation between these groups. So those with children are generally those that are not retired, and vice versa, those retired have a correlation with those without children. And you can see that on the chart, that they generally follow the same pattern, and you do see that those that are retired and those without children have a higher inflation early this year, and that looks to start just flipping over now as the mortgage rates energy price impact is reducing and the mortgage rate impact is increasing. So finally, what's next? We publish our next quarterly publication on the 26th of February, which we're very excited about that we now move to a quarterly publication. But this is the first time we've done a regular publication of the HCIs, and very much welcome the feedback of what we include in our article and our bulletin, but also in our tables itself. So if you do have any feedback on it, please let us know using the email address on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abby. Okay, from Abby to Morgan. We're making very good time, which will leave more time for the discussions and the Q&A.
Wonderful. I will try and treat my time as a limit rather than a target. So, am I going the wrong way? Yes, I am. Lovely. So my name is Morgan Wild. I am Head of Policy at Citizens Advice, and delighted to be speaking here today about the developments of the Household Cost Indices and how they can be used in practice. So, a couple of preliminaries. I work for Citizens Advice. We are the largest advice charity in the country. I think it's probably true that we're the largest in the world, but I haven't fact-checked that one. But I don't think the model exists to quite the same degree anywhere else. We help about 2.5 million people with one-to-one advice every year. We get around 30 million hits to our website, and we have the biggest financial data set of people's combined incomes, expenditures, and debts that I know of. Bit of history: we were founded at the outbreak of World War II with a dual mission to provide people with advice and to tackle underlying causes. Our first big policy win was an increase in the cheese rations for gardeners during World War II. So prices and expenditure have been at the heart of our approach since the beginning. So I got interested in this basically for two reasons. One was just the deluge of people coming to Citizens Advice needing help with cost of living over the past 2 years. It has been an extraordinary, to some extent unprecedented level of demand coming through our doors each and every day. Just by way of reference, we've broken all-time records for number of food bank vouchers. We've broken all-time records for number of people we advise on homelessness issues. We've broken out all-time records for people who haven't been able to afford to top up their prepayment meter. In 2022, we saw more people with that problem than we had in the previous 10 years combined. So it has been an extraordinary set of individual tragedies that we've been helping out with for people in the hardest situations the past 2 years. It's also been a bit puzzling, I would say. Obviously, inflation has been very high, and we haven't had very high inflation for a long time. But if you look at it in the historical view, it hasn't been unprecedentedly high. And wages arguably have kept track with inflation to at least some degree in recent months. So the level of impact has been puzzling, and the level of increase in number of people coming to us. So I was interested in that as a puzzle. I also met Jill at an ONS conference about a year ago, who collared me after I'd done a kind of similar presentation to tell me about this wonderful new thing called the Household Cost Indices. And the more I looked at it, and the more as I started kind of understanding the exciting world and terminology of price indices, your democratic versus plutocratic weighting, your arithmetic versus geometric means, the more interested I got, such that it was kind of consuming my spare time trying to work out what the impact of choosing Jevons over Carly was, etc., etc. Interested, maybe slightly cross, I think. So why cross? I think, like, as part of getting into the weeds of this, I looked back at the history of price inflation. And if you look at the start, at the outset of when we tried to start measuring inflation back in the early 20th century, you find two things. One, it was led entirely by the policy consequences of decisions. So the reason people were looking at it was because they were interested in indexation for rates. They were interested in early social security interventions, and that's why they were looking at it. Second, it was explicitly focused on measuring the experience of the poorest in society. It was looking at 2,000 urban working class families and what their experience of price changes were. It was also crap and heavily discredited, and successive generations of technocrats and statisticians have finessed techniques and made it a lot better. But I think we've got away from some of that initial intent, but what was important was the policy consequences that would follow from statistical developments, and that one of the things that matters most is the impact and experience of the poorest households. So I think it's very gratifying to see the development of a household cost indices, and everything I say today is done with a huge amount of respect for the work and effort that has gone in by ONS colleagues over the past 8 years or more. But my provocation for our chat is whether we could have got there faster and whether we could do better in the future as well. So, this is the big fact in our data. It's a boring graph for a big problem. This shows the rate of people in what we call a negative budget at Citizens Advice. So your essential spending is higher than your income. This is a consequence of our debt advice. So you come to Citizens Advice, you sit down with a big bunch of bills and try to work out how to get out of the financial difficulties that you're in. We go through a very rigorous, very intense session with you to try and put you into a positive budget, put you into the black so that you are able to put a bit of money aside each month to pay down your debts. This graph basically says that we are unsuccessful in that for about half of the people that we're helping now. So even when we've pulled out every trick of the trade to try and get people into a positive budget, we're just not successful for about 50% of people in getting them into a better, successful financial situation. Lots that we're able to do, lots that we're able to help, but we're still in a situation where for around 50%, you're still in the red after our advice. I'll have 3 key points for this presentation. So one is, as I've mentioned, I think as we've heard about from Abby and others, we've understated inflation for the poorest households. That's had bad policy consequences. 2, I think we should talk a lot more about real consumption. I think a lot of the conversations we have here are about the effects on real incomes, but I think there's an interesting story that we perhaps don't spend enough time on the effects of real consumption over the past 20 or so years. And then when thinking about social security, I think this is more for policy colleagues. We should be thinking a lot more about rates and index choices, not just about levels of benefits. Lovely. So this is that negative budget chart, again, adjusted with the latest HCIs for HCIs deciles 1 to 3. Basically, what this tells you is a couple of things. The bottom line is how total actual expenditure has changed for Citizens Advice clients since 2019. The middle line is total income. You can see that prior to October 2021, that was most of the time higher than actual expenditure. Where it was much higher is essentially down to the temporary £20 increase in universal credits. So you really see the effect of removing that provision in essentially every single Citizens Advice draft you care to shake a stick at. What's happened over the past 2 years is a massive decline in real consumption. So while income and actual expenditure have been in a bit of a dogfight about whether on average you are going to be a little bit over into the red each month, the big consequence has been a massive reduction in real consumption of about £200 a month. You see that in how people have responded to the energy crisis, where people have just heated their homes less. You see it with groceries, where people have eaten less. And you see it with transport, where people have got out and about less, all as ways to cope with a big crunch on real expenditure. That's our data. This is looking at trends in ONS, Living Costs and Food Survey, real expenditure. So what I've done with this graph is essentially look at the implied impact on real consumption by your choice of index since 2005, where we first produce the Household Cost Indices, compared to what this series would look like if you use the consumer price index. So it's basically showing you the impact of choice of price index on real consumption. Here's where we get my two nations effect, and you see that the impact of prices mean an increase in the reduction in consumption for each of the bottom 7 deciles. You see a positive impact for the top 3 deciles. I feel less certain about that one. It's probably down with where you choose the index starting period. But the trend here, I think, is fairly clear, that the impact of prices on the lowest income deciles, as Abby has shown earlier, is much higher. And then this is what happens when you just look at the adjusted real expenditure for the bottom third of households. Nominal expenditure up, 50% or thereabouts over the past 17 years or so. Real expenditure for the bottom third is now lower than it was in 2005. I think that complements what we've known to be true of the average household in the Living Costs and Food Survey. Household cost indices help us illustrate that it is now true for lower income households as well. This is a big exception from citizens' advice data. So in general, the trend has been towards lower rates of expenditure increase than inflation would suggest, implying reductions in real consumption. In rents, I think we see the opposite effect. We see the price of the cost of rents for people who come to citizens of advice going way ahead of underlying private rent inflation. I think there are kind of 3 potential explanations of that. One is that people coming to citizens' advice are renting more expensive properties. That feels unlikely. The other is that there's some kind of selection effect going here, and that people with higher rents are more likely over time to come to citizens' advice for problems. That's possible. I suspect that there is also something going on with the way rents are calculated. So this comes back to our conversation about arithmetic versus geometric means. When you calculate the change in elementary aggregates, so your most basic rates of inflation between 2 periods, you have a choice of which average you use. You can use an arithmetic average, which has some axiomatic weaknesses to expressing the change between the 2 prices, or you can use a geometric mean, which avoids those axiomatic weaknesses, but implies, because of the property of the average, that you have some elasticity of substitution in your consumption choices. So, example of what that means: if I'm out buying my favourite type of pasta, and the price of fancy pasta goes up by more than the price of very cheap pasta, then I might substitute away to the cheaper pasta. That seems perfectly plausible for my behaviour, and probably perfectly plausible from a whole of economy perspective as well. I do not think it is plausible for the poorest people in society. I don't think it's plausible for the poorest renters in society. And so I think what you've got going on here, or at least one factor that is going on here, is that the increase in private rents reflects weaknesses in the underlying rental inflation data. There's the policy consequences of some of the choices that we make here. So As everyone will know, over the past 13 or so years ago, there has been a substantial squeeze on social security payments. So this shows you the basic rates in unemployment benefits since 2010. And the bottom line shows you what's actually happened. So includes the benefit freeze. I've abstracted away from the £20 a week uplift because that was a temporary intervention, not changing the underlying rates. The middle line here shows you what happens when benefits were increased, if benefits were increased by Consumer Price Index. And the top line shows what benefits would be if they'd been increased by HCI deciles 1, 2, 3. So there is, about £15 a week difference between the top and bottom figure. In terms of the real-term effects on the basic rate of unemployment, about 70%, or 2/3, comes from benefits freeze, and about 1/3 comes from choice of inflation measure. Okay, that's essentially what my analysis shows. Close with a couple of conclusions and provocations for us all, for the ONS, for others. First is that choice of inflation measure really didn't matter that much when inflation was low. If we look at the trends here, the difference is really starting to happen over the past 2 years when inflation has been much higher. When it's high, it's mattered a lot more, led to real-term cuts to people's incomes. This is very bad. This is a bad policy consequence of the development of HCIs and its progress to national statistics not being fast enough for it to be in time for the cost of living crisis to emerge. So, good progress on HCIs, good development. I still think there is more to be done and further to push here. So I mentioned geometric averaging earlier. I think there are two reasons why inflation understates. One is the shares of expenditure for poorer households being different. HCIs do an exemplary, excellent job of accounting for that difference. Two is the effect of the average choice. Now, when I've talked about this in previous events, I think people's eyes have tended to roll because they are quite worn down and worn out by endless fights over the resale price index and formula effects and what happened to clothing in 2010 and whether it was all down to women's strappy tops or not, which is a debate I have tried to skirt around. The point I want to make is that you basically have a choice between these two averages. Carly will never imply the elasticity of substitution that the geometric mean implies. Implying that elasticity of substitution is inappropriate for poorer households because they have no elasticity with which to substitute. It may be inappropriate for certain categories of goods like housing. And I think that's all fairly straightforward and understood that you would expect that. Now, Carly also has some unlovely axiomatic properties and can lead to drifts in the construction of inflation in ways that I've been busy learning about the past year. But fundamentally, you have a choice. And I think the best choice is to go with the approach that best approximates the behaviour of poorer households and tries to mitigate the weaknesses associated with the Carley method. So, 3 lessons. One, I think, go back to history. Policy consequences should dictate the ONS's prioritisation. This, I think, is the main and potentially only reason that public statistics really matter. There has been an enormous amount of interesting, insightful work by the ONS on the cost of living in recent years, things like the Least Cost Index, things like surveys into different households' experience of the cost of living, but it's only the ONS who can prepare things to become national statistics, and so that's where their focus, I think, should be. There's a big question on overall levels of funding, which we can maybe come into in discussion, but I think from a perspective of prioritisation, that's the approach that should be taken. The other is I just wonder if there is something to spending time with the people you're measuring. So inflation models are always going to be quite low-res pictures of reality. Inflation's going to be infinitely complex, and everybody's personal experience of it is going to be very, very different. So inevitably, when you're building a model and making methodological choices, you will miss things. I think the reason I am kind of agitated and cross and enthusiastic about this is because I have come with a certain set of experiences, certain exposure to the kind of people who come to Citizens Advice, and maybe statisticians would benefit from something similar. Finally, I do think the direction of error matters when making uncertain estimates. Come back to that choice between arithmetic and geometric mean. One is kind of preferred it from a foundations of mathematics perspective. The other might be a better prediction of what is actually going on for some people. There's going to be a direction of error there, and that matters when you're making uncertain estimates. And so I think making a judgment on the direction of error and which errors matter is hard, important, inevitably value-laden, which is an uncomfortable place for a national statistical body to be, but kind of tough. It is what it is. And then some conclusions for policy people and people thinking about the consequences of inflation. Saying like the very obvious, this is just a graph, by the way, that matches actual uprating between 1990 and 2012, when the predominant measure was RPI or the Rossi, which was a variant of RPI I don't really understand, versus what would have happened if we'd uprated by CPI as then. Now, we might say that CPI is a preferable measure, but just the choice of index here is the thing that mattered to benefit levels over that period. And you lead to about 10% difference over that period, which complements the difference that we've seen for households in recent years when you compare HCIs and CPI. I think the obvious fact for policy people here is that benefit rates are inadequate, in part, well, in very significant part, because of explicit policy goals the past 13 years. But I want to make the case that rates and index choices perhaps matter as much. As a practical point of history, they are the main thing that has mattered. If there's an excellent briefing by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on this point that looks at the past 50 years of indexation policy, and basically nobody's ever having a debate about the level of benefits. They are always having a debate about whether and how to index and uprate benefits. So that's my last point to finish on, that I think this really, really matters for future benefits policy, and that there, I mean, as a start for 10, has to be a priority for the household cost indices to be a national statistic, but there should be a kind of strategic reorientation to make it a top priority for the ONS to find the best, truest understanding of inflation for the poorest households and make that a national statistic as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Morgan. Okay, we've got discussions now from Chris Giles and Paul Lewis. Paul, are you here? Do you want to come and join us up here? Maybe I'll start with Chris while Paul's moving up.
Okay, thanks very much. So I was thinking back 10 years ago, where in 2013 we were in a position where we still did a lot of things by the RPI, which the ONS recognised was not a sensible measure of inflation, and yet they proposed to do nothing about it, which was illegal, because the law stated that they had to foster for the UK Stats Authority had to foster trust in official statistics. RPI was not a national statistic, but it was still an official statistic, and we were in a very, very bad way. And you think 10 years on, and I think ONS, once it got a grip of the issue in about 2018, took a while, and RSS, talking about household costs indices, I think we are now in a much, much better place. So I really welcome the household cost indices. I thought Abby's presentation was excellent. I think it's a really good thing these things exist, and they add to human knowledge along with the existing measures of CPI and CPIH, which we have to have, which would be nice if there was only one, but we can't do that for international comparisons while also having owner-occupied housing in CPIH. And it's great that the ONS and the UK Statistics Authority have been finally very, very determined to get rid of the RPI. So 20 years after making a mess of it in 2010, in 2030 it will effectively be gone. It will still be called the RPI, but it will actually be the CPIH, and that is a very good thing. When we're looking at the results of the HCI relative to CPI, I think they're not in any way surprising, and they are exactly what you would expect. Democratic weighting means that poorer house means that the indices is higher because it's weighting food and energy in a period, a very, very unusual period where food and energy has gone up enormously in price, and then the big increase in mortgage rates also changing the experience, or the measured experience, between households with mortgages and households without mortgages. I would note that this is a very time-specific sense. Most of the time, HCI and CPIH move in pretty much the same patterns, and there will always be differences, but they generally come out in the wash. So people are not generally doing worse or better, but in the most recent period, there's definitively been a case that if your consumption basket has a high weight in food and energy, you are definitively much worse off, and the government might well have taken note of that with benefit policy in the most recent period, and sort of did in COVID, but then didn't in the energy crisis, except for very specific fuel payments. It does mean if energy prices come back down again and mortgage interest rates come back down again, these are quite likely to reverse. So it is quite likely we will go through a period where HCIs are well below CPI or CPIH. Now this is going to mean, I think, people will then start potentially going inflation shopping and saying, well, for the time being, actually uprating should be in line with CPI or CPIH. And so I do think this is an important issue, that if you want to say that you like one index over another, particularly for uprating, you do need to stick to it at all times and not just use it when it tends to be higher or lower. So I do have a couple of concerns. I think I think we understand what the results are. I think we understand where they're probably going to be going, in that we're going to go through a period where HCI is lower than CPI in future, which will be an interesting thing to watch. A couple of concerns. I do think there is a part of me that still gets concerned with the proliferation of inflation measures. We've had loads over the periods. I don't want to name all the acronyms. And it is a worry for me about people going inflation shopping, not just people or campaigners, government as well. Government goes inflation shopping and chooses which inflation measure it likes to use for paying out and collecting money. Companies do this. It just means that there's people essentially with more information and power will be able to go inflation shopping, and that I think is a bad thing generally for society. So I would really like there to be two indices which were effectively the same but with one difference, which is democratic versus plutocratic weighting. So you would have one measure which was a macroeconomic measure and one measure that was a household costs measure, and other than that they wouldn't be the same, and they would essentially be CPIH and HCI. I know you have to add another one in, which is CPI for international comparisons, but that means those three I would like to be the sort of the long-term solution. Is HCI correct? This is just my. I'm still troubled by a couple of things in household cost indices as measured. Now, I'm not at all troubled by the underlying arithmetic, geometric, Carley, Jevons, Juto, initial averaging. As long as we don't use Carley, I don't care whether it's geometric or arithmetic. They basically don't really give much of a difference. Carley is the one that is biased, and it's biased upwards, and it's a real problem in the RPI. Most of the RPI, where it can, uses Juto, and that's an arithmetic average. That is fine if people want to as far as they can want to use Juto. That is absolutely fine, and people would understand that. And for the areas where you can't use Juto, which is why clothing is such an issue, is because we have very different sorts of prices, so you can't average them in an arithmetic average in a sensible way. You can't do an average of a Gucci suit and a pair of Primark pants. You know, these things are really difficult to average when they have such different prices. Then you can use Jevons, but you can't. What I would say is you mustn't use Carley, because that is the thing that gives a very big upward bias to things. But I think so that's not an issue for the current HCIs. What I think is an issue is I'm still a bit troubled by putting mortgage payments in there, so payments of interest but not receipt of interest. So if we're thinking about the household experience, people who get an increase in their income or a reduction in their real costs because they have savings accounts, particularly pensioners, which are paying out more now than they were 2 years ago, their living standards have changed because interest rates have changed, just as people who have mortgages living standards have changed because interest rates have changed. So I am concerned that HCIs are only putting one side of the interest experience in there. And I think a second thing I'm concerned about generally with all of our price statistics at the moment is one of the things that Morgan raised, that does seem to be some slightly odd things going on with rent. ONS have already just a week ago said that they had their rent indices, private rent indices, too low and had a revision upwards in those. It does seem that more work needs to be done on private rental payments there. But those two things are relatively small, I think small things, but I think things to make sure we both conceptually and practically get right. But the situation we're in or moving towards with an HCI and a CPI based inflation indices, I think is a thoroughly good thing.
Thank you, Chris. Let's give him a little clap. Now let's have you, Paul.
Yes, thanks. I mean, when I saw the HCI published on the 4th of December, I was reading about it and reading briefing from the ONS. It was like Christmas had come early, really. It was a present we'd been waiting for 7 years. But then a few days later, like with any present, you sort of think, well, it's not quite exactly what I wanted. And, quarterly, later than the ordinary index. So now we know what HCI was in September, but we know what the CPI was in October, and it'll be the same in February. You need it to be the fourth index, published monthly, along with all the others, in my view. And I say with all the others, I mean the four of them, as Chris quite rightly was saying, RPI is going to be very dishonestly relabeled CPI. CPIH is going to be dishonestly labelled RPI in 2030. It's not the RPI, it's the CPIH. And so we'll have a much lower index of CPIH with this fictional idea of housing costs, notional idea of housing costs, inserted into it, which makes it lower than the CPI. So I think moving towards, as Chris rightly said, moving towards a CPI and an HCI, that's fine. Those are fine to have those too. And but then you've got to decide which one you use. And my other disappointment about the HCI is it's of absolutely no use or interest to anyone except the people in this room and the people watching if we don't use it. And if we had used, Morgan brought out some of this, if we had used HCI for the April up rating, and I worked out all the figures in my spreadsheet, which none of you can see, it would mean, 8.2% versus 6.7%, it would mean an extra £1.55 a week for people on attendance allowance, disabled people, £80 a year. It would mean another £100 for couples a year for couples on universal credit. It would even mean, 18 quid for the first child for people on child benefit. So these are important amounts to people, and it certainly would be my view that the whole up rating should be recalculated using HCI, because the thing I loved about it is that it clearly reflects the actual experience of people in their households. That's obviously its intention, and I think you can have quibbles about various things as Chris does, but it generally achieves that, and that was why I really cheered when I first opened this present. And I loved the idea of plutocratic and democratic as a description between CPI and HCI, which I certainly hadn't seen before. And of course, we'd all rather live in a democracy, wouldn't we, than a plutocracy, though sadly I suspect we live in a plutocracy at the moment. So I do think it's a very important move. And when you look at the list of things that it includes and the list of things that CPI does not include, you think, well, why on earth have they been doing CPI all these years? It's obviously not a good measure of inflation as it's experienced. And, a lot of people get in touch with me as a journalist through Twitter and other ways. And when I do inflation, and I do it every month, I report on what the inflation figures are every month. And I get responses saying, my inflation's not that, it's much higher than that. It's much more like the RPI. And if I'm a bit late with the RPI, because for a while anyway, ONS tried to hide the RPI, they don't do it now, it's actually in the main document. If I was a bit late with it, they said, what about the RPI? That's more important to me, that reflects my costs. And if you look at the graphs now that ONS has conveniently provided of the four different inflation measures, then the Household Cost Index tracks the RPI very close to it, much more than it does tracking the CPI, which is way below it. And I think that's another reason. I think it does reflect people's actual costs, 8.2, 8.1, 8.3% than the ones that we've actually got. It would be nice to have one inflation index. We used to have the RPI and that was it, and we all knew it wasn't terribly good. We all knew there were problems with it, but we also knew that it was the index and that was what benefits would go up by. And I remember I'm old enough to remember when benefits first went up with the RPI, as indeed did tax thresholds. Now, of course, Chris rightly says that the government does inflation shopping and it uses CPI to put up benefits, and it still uses the RPI to put up duties. Like when your car tax goes up in April, it will go up on the basis of the predicted RPI for April. 6.6%, I think it will be, or 6.5, very like, in fact, the CPI for last September. So it does pick and choose, and of course companies love putting things up by RPI. The other thing the Treasury said, when I asked it what index it used for car tax, for VED, Vehicle Excise Duty, and it said, it traditionally goes up with RPI, so it maintains its level in real terms. Well, it doesn't, because no one thinks the RPI reflects real terms. It's been discredited. But the Treasury with a straight face can say, putting it up with the RPI reflects its value in real terms. Oh, that doesn't apply to benefits, of course. They go up with the CPI, which by magic also reflects their value in real terms. So the government is guilty of index shopping, and I would really like one index. I mean, keep the CPI for the Bank of England to miss its target every month. That's fine. But if you want to look at the real effects on real people, I think the HCI has, it may have gone 90% or 99% towards the perfect index, but for me, it is so much better than the CPI, and I would really like it to be used and not just published in arrears every quarter as a kind of curiosity. And so that would be my message, I must say, to ONS. Keep it going, but publish it along with all the others every month, so that we can actually see the real effects of real inflation on real people. And that's what I think should be the future.
Thank you very much, Paul. Okay. Due to my iron chairing, we're running super ahead of schedule, and we can either take that as a longer Q&A or as an earlier lunch, or maybe some kind of arithmetic or geometric average of those two. Yeah. But Jill, I think you wanted to show us a couple of slides. Is that right?
Yes, if I...
Yeah, if we can pass the clickers right there for you.
Okay.
And then we'll just plunge into the Q&A. There's a few online, but if people want to submit any more online, we can also take some. That would be great. And then we can also take some from the audience here.
No, I'm going backwards.
Other way.
There we are. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Well, this is very similar to the chart that Abby showed, because it shows the growth rates over the period. I've put in CPI, which is in the, I think it's the black line. I don't know how well the colours are coming out. And I've used 3 income deciles, 2, 5 and 9, to represent low, medium and higher income groups of households. Now, obviously the sort of broad pattern is the same. You can see periods where they are very similar. For example, from about 2015 to 2020, you'd be hard put to see a difference between those growth rates there. In earlier periods, you can see one right at the beginning where CPI was lower, and then in the opposite happened during the financial crisis, largely because mortgage rates obviously plunged then, and that didn't come into CPI. I think one fact you do come out, and I haven't shown it this time, but I used to have a chart showing how lower income decile inflation was definitely higher than CPI, much more than it was lower than CPI. And that gels with a number of Morgan's points. And maybe I should have brought that one along too. But you can see the pattern, and you can see even in just around 2021 that CPI was actually a bit higher. Growth rate was a bit higher then. But this is the chart I really wanted to show. Now, this is a percentage increase in prices, because Morgan's talked about deciles, but I thought let's have a look at all of these household groups that we've got in the HCIs and see how they compare with CPI. Now, this is the percentage increase in prices between September 21 to September 23. I could have taken other periods. I could have taken a shorter period, or I could have started it from March 2020, which was about when the last period when the inflation rates were very similar. And also, of course, it's when lockdown started. CPI, I had great fun playing with the colours here. CPI is black, and that's the second bar from the left. The income deciles I'm shown in various shades of blue. Generally, the darker blue is the lower income deciles, and then coming back to the lighter blue being the higher income. The orangey ones are by tenure. So you've got mortgages, which is the one right at the end. You've got the outright owner-occupiers, you've got private renters, and you've got social and other renters. Now, the one bar that is lower than the CPI is at the moment, the private renters. But as has been mentioned, there are changes coming in the index of rental prices. And they are going to make quite a difference to that. They'll make a difference to a lot of these figures, including CPI. They'll make it higher. But of course, the one that they will make most difference to is the index of private renters. And if we had those new figures in there, they would be higher than CPI, certainly on my back of the envelope calculations. I think that's so. And so you would have it higher than that. So this shows that over the cost of living crisis, and when things are there, CPI was lower than everybody's rate of inflation, really, whether you're comfortably off or not, whether you own your own house outright, have a mortgage or rent, and whether you have children or you don't. The children ones are shown by the green lines. The grey is the retired versus working age. And as we've seen from the other chart, that isn't always the case, and it won't, as Chris made the point, always be the case. But it does show that there are times when things are very different, and it shows, I think, the need for HCIs and just reinforces it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. Give Jill a little clap. Okay, so if there are any questions from the floor, then I'm happy to take those. But I'm wondering if there are people, I know that my mum's watching because I told her I was chairing today. She, I'm sure, doesn't know what the difference between an arithmetic and a geometric mean is, and the difference between Jevons and Carley. And I wonder if anybody here wants to have a go at explaining that in layperson's terms.
Can I say?
Just 1 second, please. Let me. I'll come back. Yeah, I'll come back to you in a minute, please.
I'm willing to have a go.
Yeah.
Whether I can do it to satisfy. So an arithmetic average is the average you learn at school, the mean. So it's you add two things together. 2 plus 3 equals 5 divided by 2, 2.5. Yeah. A geometric average is not the average you learn at school, and it's complicated. And you multiply the numbers together and then take the root of the number of times so I'm now lost. But it does.
So that would be 2 square.
It would be
2 times 3 square rooted.
Square rooted, yeah. So it'd be the square root of 5, which is not
Square root of
6.
6.
Very
Got that, Mum?
Yeah. Okay. So that's now there are two. So Jevons is simply the geometric average. So what we just did, 2 times 3 square rooted, 6 root of 6. There are 2 arithmetic averages. One is where you just take every price you measure. You add up the price of the Primark pants, the Gucci suit. So the Gucci suit is £1,000. The Primark pants are £1. So £1,001, and you divide by 2. So you say the average price of clothing is £550.50, and then you do the same the next month. And so everything depends on what happens to the Gucci suit, not the Primark pants. Primark pants are completely irrelevant in that calculation. So it's not great for poor people's experience. And then the Carley says, well, that obviously doesn't work. So you take how much the Gucci suit has gone up, say that's gone up 10%, and how much the Primark pants have gone up, let's say nothing, and you divide that by 2, so 5%. And so you take it's the average of the change, not the average of the items. Those are the I think in the simplest way I can do. I hope that was simple enough.
It was very good, thank you, Chris. But why does it matter in this context? Why are there biases introduced, and why does it matter why does it give different stories for different groups?
Very, very simply, the problem with Carly is if prices go up and then down again, if prices rise 10% and then fall back to where they were. Roughly. I'm simplifying.
Yeah.
I am.
Okay.
Well, I will qualify that in a moment.
Okay. you qualify, but I'm trying to give the most simple. If a price was £10, goes to £20, like 100% increase, and then comes back to £10, the period 3 compared with period 1, you'd want them to be the same because their prices are the same. Carly will say its prices have still gone up.
Okay.
Even when they haven't.
Okay, let's have Jill, and then let's have Paul.
Right. Chris, I think there is one point about the Carly, and I agree with what you say. There are two versions of the Carly, just to make things even more complicated.
Okay.
There is what's called the chained Carly, which does exactly what you would say. And then there is the direct Carly, where every month is compared with the base month. And that is actually what I believe ONS use. So I have always been told.
It is, but it still has that problem.
It does. It has that problem on the annual chain link. I agree with you. It does, but it's not quite as crude as that.
I will simplify.
Paul.
I mean, the important difference between using the geometric mean and the average is simply that the geometric mean, in almost all circumstances, gives you a lower answer. So you use that to raise benefits because it saves the government money, and this is why CPI was preferred, because it means it saves the government money, and that's why they still use the RPI, which they took a lot of trouble to discredit for things that bring them in money, like the duties on beer and tobacco and cars and things like that. So, when I looked at this when the change was made, and, there may be mathematicians who say I'm wrong, but I'm fairly sure I'm right, that geometric mean is always less. You don't need to know about the nth root of n items. You just need to know it's less. It costs the government less. That's why they like it. And CPIH is even lower, perhaps a slightly different reason.
But it doesn't, though, because index-linked gilts means that ultimately that is the biggest cost that government is paying out on anything that's in.
Yeah, but that's historic. They would love to change that. NSI has already changed index-linked savings for CPI. They would love to change it.
But that's why, for the government, the problem with I agree with you. They wanted to change benefits over to save money. But it isn't the case that government ultimately is really saving from it's. By having RPI, some things linked to RPI, it's still costing the government money.
Oh.
So we should actually look at it in the round.
But that's because it can't break the contracts without renaming CPIH as RPI and saying, oh, bad luck, it's RPI.
Let me, Morgan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think I've been, gosh, it gets complex quickly, doesn't it? So I think I have been convinced that there is a problem with the Carly index in its index to January month when you switch over the weights in the way that Jill has suggested, and that introduces the possibility that you will get this kind of drift when prices go up and prices go down, and that's, I think, is entirely true. The problem, as Paul says, is that the only other option, really, for people on low incomes is a mean that is always lower than the arithmetic mean, so you will always have lower inflation. And that just strikes me as a straight-up choice, and I think you should choose the second.
I think in most things you can use Duto. I mean, you can use it's only where items are.
What's that, just for the
that's the normal. The first you average where it's an orange,
Mm-hmm.
you can get an orange in Lidl and you can get an orange in Waitrose. Yes, they're a different price, but averaging the two doesn't really matter.
Okay.
So if you can define your categories tightly enough. And ensure that you are measuring the same thing every time, you can just use the Duto, the straightforward average.
Yes.
And that is what RPI tries to do. That's where, for a lot of, I think 60% of, Jill will correct me, RPI tends to do that where it can, but you can't do it where items are different. And so, but Carly is like, the difference between a geometric average and the Juto isn't actually that large. I do accept Jevons is lower, geometric is lower, but it does have other properties that work for, particularly for economic variables, because people do substitute. But I would say for household cost indices, you would say use the normal arithmetic average at Juto where you can, and where you can't, then you use Jevons, because you don't get this problem. But and it won't make a lot of difference. I mean, the numbers will be tiny.
Let's have Paul and then Jill. Do you want to come back, or you wanted to?
Just say that I would agree that Juto, where you can use it.
Yeah, I remember I've got to talk to. Matt, please. And then.
Yeah, so I was just going to come in on a point here. Obviously, what we're talking about here is how we sort of aggregate up the elementary aggregates. And I think one thing I wanted to flag, and quite picking up something that Morgan showed earlier on about rents, is as we improve our statistics, as we continue to invest in getting better data and more disaggregated data, these differences between your elementary aggregates disappears. So thinking about the rents data we published earlier this month, one of the things there is whether you use your Carly or the Jevons makes very little difference to how these aggregates are produced, because we've got much more data and granularity, and those methods shrink an awful lot of those differences. And I think, again, as we work on with new data sources, such as the scanner data for groceries, again, those improvements will mean we have much less use of these elementary aggregates and much better data.
Okay. Paul, did you want to come back?
No, I didn't. I just wanted to wonder why you couldn't wear Primark pants with a Gucci suit, actually.
Like I say, look at my wardrobe.
Because,
my wardrobe.
You don't spend £500 on your pants just because you spent £1,000 on your suit.
Yeah. So let's stop talking about pants and get back to the So can we talk a bit about rents? So we've mentioned that rents aren't very well measured at the moment. Is that right? Has that got anything to do with newly set rents versus the rents of people who haven't moved house, for example? If there is a problem, how big it is, where it comes from, and what we can do to fix it? Because, of course, there are more people renting now in the UK than there used to be.
I'm happy to answer. So what we do, we get the data from across the UK, from, for example, the Valuation Office Agency, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and what they do is go out to letting agents, landlords, and ask for the information. So they say this property has is being rented for X pound, and then they look to go back the next year and say, what's the price of that property in 12 months' time? I think the challenge we have is we get that data aggregated up to us, and we have that information at an aggregate level, so at more of a top level than we have. And the improvements that we made, that we published impact analysis for earlier this month, is that we now are able to look at the whole of that data more. So we can do things, as Matt has said, that we can use all of that data, and it removes some of the impacts from the different the uses of methodology. But as well as that, we can now use all the data in its fullest. Previously, we used about 50% of it, which is why you don't see as much of the impacts across time as you do with the new series, and why potentially you are seeing some of the increases that haven't been shown in the current data.
Do you want to come in about this particular topic, or do you have another question?
No, sorry, just have an observation, which is fairly important to pick up something that Paul said earlier. But
Why do you mention that quickly now?
Well, it's simply the fact that let's not forget the public and the RPI. Your comment that people say my experience is closer to the RPI all the time. In fact, the RPI, 10 years after the decision to change it was originally made, is still the best known measure amongst the public. RPI was designed to represent the average person's appreciation of or experience of inflation, and the fact is the HCIs are a very, very good idea, and they do more reflect the people's actual experience. And the fact is that CPI and CPIH do not reflect experience, and that is a disgrace for our society. We need a measure which people understand. And it's really odd that after all these years, RPI is still the best known measure, even amongst younger people, many of whom were not. And why we have to put up with things that do not reflect people's experience, whichever way, I find astonishing. And the idea of changing the name of CPIH to RPI is absolutely disgraceful.
Thanks very much for that.
If I just very quickly come back on
Yes,
the
of
rents
course,
point,
yeah,
actually, sorry. So the main improvements we can make at this point on rents is getting more data and getting access to more data. That we have arguably the best source of data at the moment from all across the UK, and getting that sample in to measure the stock of properties across both those that are new lets and those that have been in their property 20 years.
Is that the difference? Is the main when you see sort of private companies like Zoopla's rent index, is that the main difference?
Yes.
It's new versus existing?
Yeah, so we included, what we look to do is the stock measure, so every property, rather than those that are new in, which at the moment arguably are much higher than if you had been in your property for 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, there are also, I'm sure, a diminishing, but a number of people who live in regulated rented properties, aren't there, where the rents are actually very low and can't change. And I imagine are they all included in an average of some sort? So
we just get the whole bit of all of the property.
Yeah, and the other thing is leasehold. I don't know how you count leasehold. Perhaps you can help us on that, because people buying leasehold think they're buying a property. They're not. They're buying the right to live in 100 cubic metres of air for 99 years. But they also face very high extra charges. They face service charges, ground rent, so those are less of an issue. Now, how are those counted? Where do they appear in the indices?
So we don't show them in the rents because they're not arguably renting the property. It is something potentially we think about, because I'm not quite sure we use them in the HCIs at the moment, of how but we want to include all the costs that you pay. So we do include, for example, land tax, which potentially is almost the same thing of paying for land.
I don't know, but I mean, service charges, are they anywhere in the figures? Because, I think an estimated, 5 million people live in leasehold property, and they face these uncapped, unregulated service charges that they tell me are going up and up, partly because ground rent is being controlled. And I wondered where they appeared in the index.
So with the HCIs for the housing costs, we aim to try and incorporate all costs. Right. So it's very much of trying to get as much of that information in as possible. Yeah.
Does John want to come in on this point? Wait for the mic, please, John. Sorry.
We've been talking quite a lot about rent, but not the dreaded word OOH, or owner-occupied housing, which is always a thorn in the side of price statisticians. But we tried to get this into the HICP back in the 1990s in Luxembourg, and we couldn't get agreement then. But we decided we would focus on it and try and get some agreement on how to measure owner-occupied housing. It still isn't in the HICP, and that's why I guess it still isn't in the CPI, which is the HICP. But instead we have what, in my view, is the dreaded CPIH, which has for housing, but in a very strange way. I suppose everybody in this room knows how it's created. It's a notional rent, depending on the results of some rent surveys that are going on. I mean, the house that I live in is a bit unusual. It's a 3-storey end of terrace townhouse, halfway between the town centre of Canterbury and halfway between the countryside. So it's not very usual, and I dread to think what the nominal rent would be of it. But in any case, I don't treat it as part of my inflation. If the nominal rents go up, it doesn't affect me at all. It's got nothing to do with it.
Does this suffer from the same problem as interest payments and receipts, in the sense of the imputed rents being income as well as expenditure for the household?
I'm not sure that's the case. I mean the fact about owner-occupied housing is it's really hard. I sat on the ONS's panel when we decided, so I'm partly responsible for the rental equivalents back in about 2010, and it was really difficult because there's real problems with using mortgages as a measure of what owner-occupied housing costs. The net acquisition thing is just really weird, and there's real problems about what are you actually using there. And in the end, we felt that if you're trying to work out what does a house give you, and what would you pay for that? If you had to pay for it somewhere else in the market, you're paying basically for things like location, shelter, these other housing services, and it is an attempt by using rental equivalents to say what is the price of these housing services. And so I can understand why people don't like it, and but I find a better measure.
Let's
Sorry,
John,
yes,
and
of
then-
course, yes.
I resigned from the ONS Technical Advisory Panel mainly because of the attention that was being paid to the coming CPIH. And of course today, and for several years now, this has been marketed by the ONS as its main inflation index. But I've never met anybody that ever uses it. I don't see how you can justify it.
Yeah. Just we'll come to that. Let's have Paul, and then there's a gentleman here, and then we'll come to you next.
I was just going to say that all these complexities about owner-occupied housing are the sort of intellectual complexification. Yes. You know, if I've got a mortgage and the price goes up, my inflation rate goes up, and that should be reflected in the index. The rent, the notional rent, or I called it earlier fictional rent figure, is neither here nor there to me. It's what my mortgage costs me. And you know, people like me who are old enough to be blessedly free of a mortgage, we have an entirely different set, or at least a subset of housing costs, but we don't have to face those mortgage rises. So just put in the actual cost and don't sit around for months discussing how you reflect, you know, what, oh, it's really nice because you've got a big house near Canterbury and the roof doesn't leak, and the value of that. That doesn't affect my feeling of inflation. And that's what we need, a feeling of inflation, how it affects me.
Let's have this chap here. Is it about housing, right? Yeah.
It's about rent. So my name's Robin Sillers. I work for a company called PayProp, and we provide technology to enable letting agencies to collect rent for about 160,000 tenancies across the UK. Just a quick question on how rental price is calculated for the housing cost indices. Obviously, the different types of properties, and they have different rates of inflation depending on how much the prices are going up. How is that taken into account? So that's, I suppose, question one. Secondly, we know about, I think it's Hampton's estimate, about 70% of rental properties are leveraged, so they will go up depending on the costs that the ultimate landlord is experiencing, whether that's an increase in mortgage or an increase in costs from building supplies or any repairs and renewals and that sort of thing. And thirdly, for rental price indices and sort of working them out, how do you correlate that with income distribution? So you've got broken out different sort of income rates. Can you break that out by tenure as well?
So from the rental perspective, so we use a fixed basket of properties based on all of the information that we essentially get, and we say a detached property in this area cost is this much, and then we always track that type of property over time. So instead of us saying at the point that the average is this and then it's changed by this, we go further down and disaggregate it down and saying a detached property in, I don't know, in Wales of some area has gone up by this much, just trying to disaggregate it by as far down as we possibly can. So trying to take into, as you mentioned there, that price movement at different property types in different areas, and just understanding that change as we go through. So rental prices the same will go through and goes into rental prices themselves, go into CPI and CPIH, and then when we look at the rental equivalents, we then say of the rental prices we have, we then look to compare that to a home and saying this, if you lived in that home, this would be the equivalent rental price for that mortgaged home, and that's how we add then into owner-occupied housing costs. In terms of your third question, and just to check that I'm right, understanding whether you can split the rental prices down by different income deciles. So no, how we almost do it is we say this is the expenditure at this income decile, and then we then put the price movements for each, for example, rents, onto that income decile itself. So we don't always do it the opposite way around. So the answer I think is no.
And this gentleman here would like to reply about, it's about housing still, yeah? We're staying on housing.
It would indeed. I'm sorry to have to tell you that this has gone on for more than a decade now. Chris and I, my name's Sean Richards, by the way, I write the Not a Yes Man's Economics blog, had this debate a decade ago. And I would argue, in every single respect, he's been wrong. Why? As he said, he was on the committee that proposed rental equivalents. My argument then was a bit on the line of what Paul just said, that you're imputing something when you have real numbers. We have two real numbers for when someone buys a house, what they pay for it, and if they have a mortgage, the mortgage on it and the costs. So you can work out a cost of living number from that. That's quite simple. Instead, the Office of National Statistics has ploughed ahead with this rental equivalence line that has a fantasy here, that your circumstances are the same as if you paid rent, except you're not paying any. Who'd buy a house if you're paying rent? No one, would they? So that's flawed. Then there's a secondary problem. Even if you like the theory bit, the actual measurement of rents in the UK has been, if I'm polite, a shambles. And this is a point I made a decade ago. They did not know the rents.
Okay.
It was only a fortnight ago they changed them. So the whole situation is a mess. I welcome Jill's effort and John's with the new measure and the idea of a capital component where you try and put mortgage rates in house prices.
That's a very helpful intervention. Let me just ask Chris Jill and then Chris if they want to respond, please, and then maybe we'll move on from housing, unless Abby you want to say something else now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get consensus on how to measure owner-occupied housing. It's well known as being the most difficult problem for any consumer price index. Somebody once said there is no method of measuring owner-occupied housing that cannot be subject to absolutely devastating criticism. And I think that just about sums it up. I mean, certainly for the Household Cost Index, I think we've got to stick to things that actually people experience. So it is mortgage and stuff. But, you know, there are arguments for all other methods as well.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
I will just agree with Jill because I think it's difficult. Anyone who pretends it's easy, if you want to pretend it's easy, then I just disagree with you entirely. The whole point was I wasn't leading the discussions. Different countries do it in different ways. The US has a rental equivalence in its CPI and its PCB for the same reasons that the UK went down there. Canada doesn't for good reasons. Countries differ on this. The EU hasn't been able to have a harmonised index because no one agrees about what to do, and it can't, and it doesn't happen, even though they've had an ambition to have it for decades. So it's difficult. I will say that I mean, just to make a provocative point, if I might, if you are going to have mortgage interest in your price index and uprate by it, you do need to accept that when mortgage rates come down, your uprating will be very, very low, and that means that renters will get hit because the mortgage rate has come down. And I think this would be a real problem that when HCI goes below CPI, and it will,
yes, it will,
then people need to be consistent in the way they talk about things. And I'm very glad that everyone said yes. I will hold you. I will hold you to that in future.
I think we're going to move on in a minute. I'm just going to come back to John, and then we're going to change.
Just a very small point
slightly.
on this question of owner-occupiers. I agree entirely that in general, owner-occupied houses are capital items. Most people, who are existing owner-occupiers, if they're sitting around the dining table, they're all whooping up if they know that the prices are rising. That's great. But there are people that do not do that, are the people who are looking for their first house. And when the house prices shoot up, their hearts shoot down. So I think there would be that would be one way of including house prices in the index.
Let's have Morgan quickly, and then we'll move on to
just
a question.
A very last point on rents, if you'll allow me. I think I take the point that using interest payments will have an effect on the headline rates for household cost indices. That's why I think you do need to be quite selective in what you are using for benefits uprating, in reflection that the vast majority will be the recipients of either social housing rent increases or private housing rent increases. And that's why I think it is very welcome that a household cost indices allows that granularity so that you can see the kind of closer to the true inflation effect.
Let me change topics slightly. There's a question here, should the Bank of England be using CPI as its inflation target if it doesn't reflect the experience of families? So perhaps we can use this as, if anybody wants to make a kind of a broader conceptual defence, I don't know, Matt or Chris or anyone else, on what the advantages of CPI are, because we've spoken a lot about the disadvantages and the shortcomings.
I have a one-word answer to that, is yes. And it is, you do, in macroeconomic terms, want to use a plutocratic index.
Yes.
That is the amount of spending. So you're looking at the amount of spending, which is what generates inflationary pressure. It is ultimately the thing that, if you want to control inflation, you need to look at the plutocratic index. And it's different from what your indexing questions are for benefits and things. So that's why I'm totally comfortable with having a CPI type measure and a HCI type measure. And if we want to end up with two, and then government, and then it's for people like Morgan to persuade government on which one you use for uprating, because we know what governments are like. But I think that is the place that we can find there's a lot of consensus around this. I don't think, often we have these rather intense arguments about this, but actually the differences aren't as large as people often think.
That's right. So just to unpack what you said, you're saying that the plutocratic weights are the right thing to use when we're talking about the amount of spending in the economy as a whole, because rich people spend more, so they should count for more in the index. Matt, do you want to add anything, or Abby?
Yeah, I think first thing I should say is it's not for the ONS to decide what people should be using for different indices. It's our role is to provide them and say what their best purposes are. And I think the key thing here is, as Chris just said, we've got different problems. You need different tools to address those problems. I think that's why we have the CPI as a macroeconomic measure that's consistent with the GDP measurement, and the HCIs give you something that's more reflects the different types of household out there in the public.
I'm just going to, there's a couple of questions here, and then I'm going to ask the panel for any final reflections, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Well, I think there is consensus amongst the panel that the HCIs are a good thing and that they're needed. So can I ask a question to the ONS really about, because currently the HCIs are experimental. Is there a timeline for developing them and providing them with national statistic status? And also, picking up on Paul's earlier point, when will they be published monthly?
Probably take that one. So Abby and I were just having a conversation before this meeting that one of the next steps, having got data quarterly, is to speak to the OSR about, because obviously it's their decision on whether something's a national statistic or not. We'll have a conversation with them about what steps they think we need to take to get that sort of status. I don't think that should stop anyone using the HCIs in the meantime. Experimental status pre-states that we've been working on them, and all our statistics are subject to continuous improvement. I don't think that should stop anyone using them. In terms of the publication frequency, we have just got to moving them to quarterly frequency. That's taken an awful lot of work. We have no plans to move to a higher frequency at this point, given we're putting all our resources into improving our whole suite of statistics. The benefits we've talked about in terms of rents and new data sources will feed into all our statistics, and we're focusing on that at the moment. From our perspective, we continue to look, see what users want from us, our whole suite of statistics, and where people want us to put our investment. I haven't yet had a convincing argument why we need, if we're looking at the HCIs for uprating, if that's the use people think they should be put to, why one needs that on a monthly basis, given uprating tends to happen at sort of less frequent paces. So I think at the moment we have no plans to move to monthly frequency.
Let's have John, and then I'll ask the panel to wrap up.
On this question of the CPI and its status as the main macroeconomic index with the bank, I think there are a lot of advantages in keeping that. Of course, it's still the HICP, and we're no longer in the EU, so we're not legally bound to keep it. But I think it gives us a great advantage of comparability with all the countries in the EU, and many other countries, in fact, I think even including the US, publish an HICP. Thank you.
I think the Fed targets the PCE, though, doesn't it? I think
it targets the core PCE.
Yeah, core PCE. The Fed targets core PCE.
And it has a CPI which is not like our CPI, but it does have an HICP which is the same as our CPI. Just to be really boring about it.
So I think I'm going to ask Morgan first.
Yeah.
Any final reflections, and then I'm going to go to Jill, and then the commentators, and then the ONS, and then me.
Yeah, so I'll finish off by just saying that I think that what we have seen, like, look, the Chancellor in the past two autumn statements has wanted to increase benefits by the rate of inflation. And I think if we take the household cost indices as more informative of what inflation has been for the people on the lowest income, he has failed in his policy intent. He has wanted to maintain incomes in real terms, but he has cut benefits income by 4%, purely unintentionally, where quite unlike the previous decade where the intent very much was to reduce benefit incomes by below inflationary rates. So I think that has a consequence. I think there's an education job for the ONS and others here to do about the impact of that decision, an education job to help departments like Department for Work and Pensions to move towards using the Household Cost Index and make it more well known that that is in fact what has happened over the past 2 years particularly. So I think very welcome to see the HCIs used. I'd love to unpick the ambiguity about whether it matters, whether they're a national statistic or not for formal policy purposes. I think there really needs to be a push to get these sorted and get them used, given that we know that the rate of inflation has very likely been higher for poor households.
Jill?
Yes, thanks. I'd like particularly to pick up the question about their national statistics status, because, okay, in one sense it doesn't matter because they're still the same things, but it does. It was always intended to be a sort of kite mark and a mark of quality. We've only just got to quarterly, and there are a few tidying up points to do and so forth, and we need to let them run for a bit and see if they don't fall over. Obviously, I'd like to see them go monthly, but that's probably not the top of my priority list. I think the key point is I would like to see series that can be considered and can obtain national statistics status by around 2027, 2028. And that is because, as has been mentioned, the Retail Prices Index will effectively morph into CPIH in 2030. Now, when John Pullinger first announced the plan for the RPI, he did say that if people wanted more of a household index, he would want then to offer them the Household Cost Index. So basically, people who've been using RPI can then have a choice if they want to stick with the plutocratic index, or they're happy with that. If not, they should have household indices. So I would like to see them get national statistics status by then.
Okay.
I think longer term there are a lot of other things we can look at, like obviously looking at different types of products that different types of households buy. There are some debates and other things, but I'd like to see the core series get there.
Thanks, Jill. I'll do Paul and then Chris, and then we'll finish with the ONS.
Yes, I mean, slightly disappointing to think it might take another 7 years before we finally get this thing right. But I think, it may well be worth the wait. As for why it should be monthly, Matt, I think there is an important, first of all, it's a kind of status point. This is a different index that's of a lower status than the ones that are published every month. But also you couldn't really have the debate when you've got the CPI published in the middle of October, and you have to wait until the 4th of December to have the HCI published. If you're going to have a debate, they've both got to be available. We wouldn't have known the benefit rates until this week if we'd had to wait for the HCI. So I think they should be together. I mean, CPIH is going to be renamed RPI, which of course will save the government a lot of money, as you were pointing out, for index-linked gilts. But, you know, at the moment, I only know of the English water regulator that uses CPIH, but I know the ONS loves it. No one else loves it or uses it. And the thought that that will become known as the RPI, which, as quite rightly said, is the index people have in their head. Oh, it's, what do prices go up by? Oh, it's called the RPI, isn't it, if they know anything? I think that really is a gross deception, I must say. And I would like to see the HCI move forward much more quickly and become the index that reflects real people's experience of inflation. And by real people, I didn't just obviously mean the bottom 3 deciles. Everybody's real experience in their different circumstances of inflation. I think that is so important, and I really hope it doesn't take another 7 years.
Thanks, Paul. Chris?
I would like to say that I think there's a path to a much better world, and I think we're on it. So I'm really quite optimistic. I think compared with 10 years ago, we are in a much, much better place. I think the renaming of the RPI to CPIH, or the relay, is actually the best compromise there was out there. It'd be much better just to have deleted the RPI entirely, because we couldn't change the way it was measured. But I think the journey we're on a journey, hopefully, sooner rather than later, to 2 effective indices I'm going to leave, which are one CPI-ish measure, either CPIH or CPI, and one HCI measure, published monthly together. I think that is something the ONS should do, so that people can see the 2 beside each other. And then hopefully we will end 20 years of arguing about indexation. And we can instead argue what's much more important about the levels of payments, rather than what they're going up by, because it's the levels that ultimately matter. And we should got to get away from these silly indexing debates.
Thank you very much, Chris. And then whether...
I will start, and I'm sure Matt will have some
Matt
comments.
wants to say something.
So just on the HCIs, to say that we have been developing them, and we are continuing to think of the development. They are a priority for the ONS, as we include it in our landscape and our use cases, and we will continue to do that. In terms of the timeliness, I will add to both of your points that this was our first quarterly publication. We need to essentially make it more efficient, and we aim to bring them more in line with the CPI when we publish them quarterly, so they are on the same time period, but that will just take us a bit of time to do, or as Jill called it, washing up, or yes, whatever saying in terms of making our improvements. So I think the key one for us is very much that we take on the views and your thoughts, and if there are any comments, we very much welcome your feedback at this stage.
Matt?
The only thing I was going to add is, I've been really appreciated all the positive comments around the HCIs since in the last week or so. And I think in terms of raising their profile, I think it's down to everyone in this room and online to sort of raise the profile and start using these more, and that will generate more interest in them and more awareness. And ultimately, the more it's used, the greater priority it is for the ONS.
Thanks very much, Matt. So thank you all very much for coming to talk to us today. Thank you very much for the hard work at the ONS and being responsive. I know that there's a debate about how much further there is to go, and I just want to end by echoing Chris's point about the levels of things. So however you measure inflation, real wages in the United Kingdom kind of more or less hasn't gone anywhere for 15 years. Whereas in a typical 15-year period, or the preceding one, maybe they would have risen by as much as a fifth. And that's the really big story to do with living standards. And that's why we at the Resolution Foundation wrote a book about that last week called Ending Stagnation, which you can download and see our slides on our website. So I'll add in there and say thank you all very much.